What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my competitive tier list for the November 2020 format. It's been a while since we've done one of these videos, and a lot has changed. We've had numerous sets come out, like Phantom Rage, Maximum Gold. We even have the Charmer structure deck coming out a little bit later this week. We've had plenty of large tournaments take place in the online environment, relatively speaking, and that's actually changed things up significantly. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. I know you guys are eager to see where everything sits, and I'm excited to bring that to you. So before we do that, let's go ahead and do a rundown of the tiers. We have tier 0, 1, 2, Rogue, and everything else. As always, until coronavirus is under control, it is definitively the 100% tier 0 deck, because we're on what now, like month 8 of coronavirus, and yeah, there's lockdowns and stuff going on. Some local stores are opening up. If you guys are playing in person, just please be careful. We do not have this under control yet, whether you live here in the States, whether you live in other countries like in Europe. Some places are really well off, like if you're in Asia and watching this, but overall, let's just get over this so we can go back to playing in person, because I know a lot of us really want to do that. But overall, these tiers are just going to be dictated by representation as well as a deck's power, and we're going to cover that in depth as we talk about each strategy. And look what we have here. We have a brand new deck, being Virtual World, making its way onto the tier list, and I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. I'm going to put this at tier 1. Is this going to be tier 1 for long? I can't say, but if you guys were paying attention to the Luxury Championship Series 8 event, this deck had the highest representation in the 208 players that were competing, and if that weren't enough, it also took up 7 of the top 16 spots. Now, I think we can delegate a lot of that responsibility to the fact that maybe people weren't as familiar with the deck as they should have been, but the fact that 7 of the top 16 made it, I think, is pretty significant. Even the players competing in the event said they were not expecting to play nearly as many mirror matches as they were. I think the player who ultimately ended up winning played a mirror match in the top 8, top 4, and for the finals to take the whole event. But Virtual World is a very, very strong deck, a deck that can really turbo out True King of all Calamities as quickly as it can, and combo decks kind of just fold to a card like that. Not to mention the deck is very adaptive. It can search out a lot of its core engine pieces. I think it just suffers from some consistency issues, and if you don't really have enough virtual cards to get things going, that's where you're going to suffer. But I mean, it's got a lot of very good tools that other decks don't have access to. If there's a deck that's going to get True King of all Calamities banned, it's probably going to be this one, and honestly, no one likes lingering effects, and True King of all Calamities is just ridiculous. But the deck is so much more than just Calamities, right? Because you're able to go into a plethora of very powerful Synchro 6, Synchro 9, even sometimes Synchro 12, depending on which cards you're playing. It actually has a hand loop that you can incorporate. It's got plenty of good Xyz monsters it can tutor into as well, and on top of that, it can also play Zeus, because why not, right? I mean, Zeus is just an absurd Yu-Gi-Oh card, and any deck that can play it should be, because that card will definitely win you games that you have no right winning, and will just seal the game up nice and quick. So I think for the time being, and maybe throughout the rest of November, Virtual World is going to be a tier 1 threat, but I think it might slowly start to make its way down once people start to realize and understand where the choke points are, because they're rather unintuitive. But once people start to side appropriately for the deck as well, we're going to have to see where it ends up. But maybe for the rest of November and maybe early December, Virtual World is going to be at the top. Moving on along to our next deck, and that is Monarch. Monarch is just really not cutting it. Monarch is nothing like how it used to be. Talk about a fall from grace. Monarch just can't keep up with some of these decks now. It's just way too power crept. It's just kind of really held back by an old mechanic being tribute summoning. It's just not cutting it in this current format. Infernoble is still a solid tier 1. I'm going to put this slightly above Virtual World, just because Virtual World is kind of, for me, like in the tier 1.5 category. So I'm going to put Infernoble Knight above it. Infernoble Knight's more tried and true. It's not so much of a one-hit wonder like Virtual World is at the moment. We'll have to see how the format progresses, but Infernoble Knight has just been doing absolutely crazy things for the past several months. It can rip cards out of your opponent's hand with Smoke Grenade. It can set up boards with multiple negations. It can play through Interruption. It is able to amass so much damage onto the field. It's just everything you want a tier 1 deck to do, and until we get the ban list coming in December, I don't expect this deck to be going anywhere, so you can still expect to see a lot of Infernoble Knight both online and in person. That brings us to our next deck, which is in fact Altergeist. I'm going to put Altergeist in the Rogue tier here. What's interesting about Altergeist is that its win rate online is actually sitting over 50%, which is not bad, but the thing is you're not really seeing tons of people playing it, especially compared to the tier 1 and tier 2 strategies we're going to be talking about throughout this video. And so I really can't justify putting it higher than that, because if you're not going to see a lot of the deck, you really shouldn't prepare for it too much. I think you should just familiarize yourself with the Altergeist cards if you don't already know what they do, because the deck's been around for quite some time now. That's going to move us on to our other deck here, which is Guru Control. Plays very similarly to Altergeist, although the cards are quite different. One big difference is that Guru can take advantage of something like Numeron, and the Numeron cards, as we know, are incredibly busted. I mean, Zexal, I feel like, is in the league of calamities and should just be banned, but that's for a different video. I think Guru's actually had a top 16 finish within the past month or so. This was obviously pre-Phantom Rage, and if it can get going, it's very difficult to stop. But again, numbers are everything. Yeah, it may have had like a decent finish in one tournament, and maybe it might be doing okay at like a smaller level, but representation, it really just isn't there, and I can't really justify putting it anything above Rogue. That's going to bring us to our next deck, though, and that is Eldritch. Eldritch is going to be our first deck sitting at tier 2. This is going to encompass all of the Eldritch variants, because I know there's a lot of them. There's like Invoke Eldritch, there's Dogmatica Eldritch, hell, there's like Zodiac Eldritch now too, which is pretty cool, by the way. At its core, Eldritch is just such a strong control deck because so many of the cards are self-replacing, and it's very difficult to stop this deck once it gets going. And it's a lot more splashable with other more powerful archetypes that might be more aggressive, like Invoked, like Zodiac, like Dogmatica, and so you get to play those power cards on top of it, which is why you get to see Eldritch still at the top. I definitely don't think it's at its former glory tier 1 status like it used to be several months ago when we still had Adamancipator at the top with Eldritch, which, speaking of which, we have that coming up, but I still think it's a fairly decent option. We actually just saw it do fairly well at the latest LCS, and so I think Eldritch is going to be sticking around to a very moderate degree. Next up is Adamancipator. I'm actually going to put this at Rogue. When it comes to Adamancipator, there are still a lot of people wanting to keep this deck going, even though Block Dragon is banned, but it really just doesn't have the representation. It did get top 8 at a Pro Play Tour regional, I believe, which was about 70, 80-ish players, which is neat, but the thing is, I think when you look at the just wider pool of combo decks and what those decks are able to do, you look at that and question, why would I play Adamancipator when I can play some of the other combo decks that do what Adamancipator can do, but sometimes even more unfairly, because Block Dragon was one of the reasons why you played Adamancipator, right? And so now that that's banned, I think there's a less justified reason to play it. Some people still love the deck though, and they're going to make it work, but I can't really put it anywhere above Rogue. Now that's going to bring us to our next deck, and that is Dogmatica. So when it comes to Dogmatica, this is going to kind of be Invoke Dogmatica. I know it's weird, a lot of these decks, especially at this tier 2 level, are like hybrids, so it's like kind of hard to really pinpoint like one card to encompass all of them, but I think if there was like one deck, Invoke Dogmatica is probably the most popular Dogmatica variant, and so Ecclesia is going to be representing that. Invoke Dogmatica is just a very solid deck that's had a very good performance over the past couple of months, and going into this weekend as well through Phantom Rage, it is seemingly resilient. This deck is very good at generating tons of advantage. It doesn't do a ton of unfair things like some of these other combo decks might, but it's very good at adapting, and it's good at playing just traditional Yu-Gi-Oh! And what I mean by that is it's very good at just one-for-oneing your opponent's resources efficiently, generating its own advantage, and just playing this war of attrition with your opponent. So if you can slow your opponent down just enough, this deck can really thrive. A lot of people just really like the way the deck plays, and I feel like this is going to be a solid tier 2 contender for quite some time. Next up is Orcust. Orcust is really not doing anything, to be honest. It's kind of weird how one of the best decks just previously now is just so bad in the face of some of these combo decks. I think its win percentage online is like in the 40%, which is just not good at all. I can't really justify putting Orcust anywhere. You might see one or two, but it's really not going to pop up too frequently. Same thing goes for a deck like Gren Maju. Like, this is one of those decks that some people just forget about. And honestly, Gren Maju can kind of thrive in that sort of environment, because if people aren't prepared, they can just win out of nowhere, and that's when it becomes a pretty solid deck. But it's one of those decks that once people know about it, it becomes infinitely worse. There are some interesting cards that play in the Gren Maju deck against some of these top meta decks, so just be mindful, but don't expect to see it anywhere. Next up is Salamangreat. This is a really weird one because its win percentage online, I believe, is actually above 50%, and a lot of people are actually playing the deck, but the thing is, when you look at it in the face of some of these other decks, Salamangreat is just too fair. So if anything, like, maybe put this at the top of your rogue list, because just representation wise and just win percentage wise, it actually kind of outclasses some of these other decks, but it just can't make the cut. Just in the face of some of the combo decks, they just completely outrun it. Some of these control decks can play the long game better than Salamangreat, so there really isn't a niche right now for Salamangreat to really fill, although there are still a fair amount of people, especially online, that are playing the deck. The deck isn't bad. It's a very well-rounded deck, one of the most well-rounded decks of all time, but I think just in this particular metagame, it isn't able to find its spot yet. Salamangreat thrives once the meta has been more figured out, and so I think once we're done with that transition period post Phantom Rage, you're going to see Salamangreat maybe start to go up more because people might figure out the right hand trap lineup or the right tech cards to play to be able to combat the top meta strategies. Next up is Dragon Link. I'm still going to put this at tier 1 for the time being. The reason for that is because Dragon Link is still incredibly oppressive. What's weird is that Dragon Link is actually, I feel like, in decline, and I think that's with the rise of Zodiac. I'm just going to talk about Zodiac now. When it comes to Zodiac, Zeus and Zodiac is a problem for Dragon Link, and this deck kind of keeps Dragon Link in check, and by having Zoo in the tier 1 category, it kind of opens a window for some of these other decks to be able to enter and have a chance. That's why I think Virtual World was able to see such success over the weekend, because Virtual World Zodiac matchup is actually rather good, and so Dragon Link is actually having a difficult time thriving. A lot of people are still on it, a lot of people are still dedicated to it, and it's still one of the strongest combo decks in the format, but with new contenders entering the fray like Zodiac, like Virtual World, it's getting harder to justify playing a deck like Dragon Link because now we have a lot of new cards, the format's starting to warp a little bit, and things are not as clean cut as they used to be, and so Dragon Link might be in decline as a result of that. It might even get bumped down to tier 2. We'll have to see. That might be saved for the December tier list, but for right now, just keep in mind that these are probably going to be your top 4 decks that you're going to be expecting to see a lot of, both online and in person. Next up is Phantom Knights. I'm going to put this at Rogue. A lot of people really wanted Phantom Knights to be able to do something, and a lot of people were playing it at stuff like the LCS, but it really just wasn't able to convert. The deck's really cool. Anyone who's a fan of like Burning Abyss PK Fire or like any sort of like PK hybrid deck would love to play a deck like this, but it just doesn't have the results yet to get there. It's a very strong deck, but just in the face of all these other top decks, it really just isn't doing enough. Next up is Madolche. I'm going to put Madolche like in the everything else tier. It just doesn't really have its place at the moment. I know a lot of people love the deck, but it just really hasn't been doing too much. I think it may have gotten like a top 8 or a top 16 at a smaller tournament, but that's the only type of result I've seen anywhere, and that's really all Madolche is going to be doing. Next up is Shaddoll. A lot of people love Shaddoll, and I'm happy to say that this is a good rogue pick. People were playing Invoke Shaddoll, Dogmatica Invoke Shaddoll. Winda's still a hell of a card. It shuts down all of these oppressive combo decks. It's a super strong deck, but I think as long as most decks have a way to deal with Winda, then Shaddoll isn't really too problematic for them to worry about. There's a lot of different ways you can build Shaddoll, and you can expect to see a fair bit of it, but it's not going to be doing too much in the overall scope of things. Next up, we have Sky Striker, and I'm going to go ahead and throw this in the rogue tier as well, as a matter of fact. Sky Striker actually had a decent amount of representation in the LCS, and it's a deck that people still really like to play. It's a deck that actually has a decent win percentage online as well, very similar to something like Salamangreat. It kind of has a tool for every type of situation, and people are still trying to figure out if there is a spot for Sky Striker to be able to thrive, and maybe there is. We'll have to see. I think it's still a little bit early, but there are people on Sky Striker. There are people trying to make it work. I think this deck gets a little bit worse with Virtual World being in the meta, because with outs to Mystic Mine, that's how Sky Striker was winning a lot of these games against Infernoble, against Dragon Link, and so the thing is, Sky Striker might get knocked down just because of that. I think people, again, need to wait for the meta to kind of smooth out a bit, see where the openings are, and then adapt their strategy accordingly to be able to maximize Sky Striker's potency. Next up is Prank Kids. Prank Kids have been on fire as of late. They didn't do any converting in the LCS, but in my previous 2 meta-analysis videos, Prank Kids have been winning a lot of smaller tournaments, and in the LCS specifically, I think it took up about 10 to 11% of the overall participants, so there was a lot of people playing Prank Kids just to see how good the new Meow Meow is, and having a Battle Butler that can basically just be activated twice is pretty good. I mean, you really can't say no to a double board wipe, but it just didn't convert. But I think just on the representation of it alone justifies over the course of the past few weeks being in the tier 2 slot. You need to be prepared to see people playing this deck, because if it has a high representation, just because it isn't converting doesn't mean people aren't on it, and then maybe it may not be one of the best decks. But if a lot of people are still playing it and you come across 2 or 3 of it in a tournament that's 8 rounds, if you're not prepared to play against it, then that could be your ultimate downfall, because you should not underestimate the deck just because it had one poor performance. So prank kids are going to be around for the foreseeable future. We'll have to see if this dies down over the next couple weeks, if people might just flock to some of these other decks, but a lot of people want to see how good this Link 1 monster really is. And that brings us to our last deck, being Dinosaur. I put this down to tier 2, and the reason for that is because of Virtual World. As long as Virtual World is this high on the totem pole, I think it's difficult for Dinosaur to be able to compete. Virtual World's matchup against Dinosaur is incredible, because if Dinosaur makes Virtual World go first, they're going to make True King of all Calamities, which Dinosaur can do nothing about for the most part. And then even if they try to go the Sky Striker route and Mystic Mine them, then Virtual World has a built-in trap card to be able to out Mystic Mine. So all the ways that Dinosaur thrives against some of the top combo decks like Dragon Link, like Infernoble Knight, don't work against Virtual World. And so I think this is kind of a natural check on Dino. Dino's still an incredible deck, and people are going to continue playing it because people love dinosaurs. But I think for as long as Virtual World is in the meta, Dinosaur is going to be dropped significantly, because people are going to quickly realize that that is a much harder matchup than you might think. But guys, that's going to wrap it up for my competitive tier list for the November 2020 format. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to put every deck on this tier list, but that would be like an hour-long video, and let's be honest, no one has time for that. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.